Hello y'all, we are here to do some review for the AP exam. Specifically, this video is going to focus on historical period, or HP1. It's the very first historical period of the class. As we move through the historical periods, we're going to be talking about some specific examples, some specific terms. These are the kinds of things that you might need to know to answer multiple choice questions or to use as evidence on the SAQ, the DBQ, the LEQ, right, all the writing parts of the test. What the College Board uses to write its exam questions is what's called the course and exam description, or the CED, the SED. In the SED are key concepts. These are understandings that the College Board wants you to have. They're the basis for all of the test questions on the test. So I would strongly recommend that you have a copy of the SED or the key concepts packet that I gave you in class handy while you are watching through this video or any other review videos that you watch. Take notes on specific historical evidence like terms, right, that we discuss and which ones would connect to each key concept as evidence. In some of the other videos, we're going to be going following the key concepts a little bit more closely. But for historical period 1, there is like a ton of overlap. There's relatively few key terms, so we're going to go more like term by term. So, historical period 1, first period in the course. This period tends to make a lot more of an appearance in the multiple choice than I think sometimes students anticipate. The College Board states that it only makes up 5% of the APUSH exam, and so I think people kind of dismiss it, but I always have students tell me after the test that there was like way more stuff than 5%. I don't think the College Board is lying. But as this slide mentions at the bottom, you won't have a DBQ on this period. It's not fair game for that. You won't have the first SAQ, that's the Dueling Historians one. And you also won't have the second SAQ, the one that's primary source. None of those will come from historical period 1. So it can only come up in the multiple choice, SAQ 3 or LEQ, and since it can't be any of the part of the like higher weighted segments like the DBQ, I think it tends to feel kind of overrepresented in the multiple choice. So always a good idea to spend some time with this in your review. When you think about the historical periods, one of the first things that you want to make sure you know is what is the significance of the starting and ending dates that the College Board has for this historical period. They're not random. They're often starting or ending dates for like questions or prompts. So for this historical period, 1491 is sort of symbolic. It represents the fact that you need to know some things about Indigenous America before Columbus arrives in 1492. 1607, of course, is the founding of Jamestown, the first permanent British colony in the Americas. So this historical period covers colonization, but before the British. This slide here is a summary of all the things that you might need to know about Native American societies, Indigenous societies before Columbus, so the 1491 period. Number one, you do need to have a sense of, like, geographically, what are some general regions of the modern day United States. The College Board has asked APUSH students in the past to, for example, identify 2 regions and compare and contrast how a specific trend or event influenced those regions. You can define the regions yourself if you get a question like this. Like, there's not a specific set list that you have to memorize, but if you're not really solid on geography, it is a good use of your study time to pick like 2 or 3 regions. Make sure you know a general name for the region, like how you would describe that region, at least kind of one modern day state to anchor yourself in the right area, and then a little bit about obviously the history of that region. So for example, a region that you could pick would be like the Southeast, and maybe like North Carolina or Virginia as a state there, or the Southwest, Arizona, right, would be a good state there. The Midwest and Illinois, right? That's the kind of thing that you want to kind of focus on. For HP1 specifically, as far as regions and geography go, you need to be able to describe the indigenous societies who lived in that region and their adaptations to their environment. So how the environment impacted their like culture or society. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a few examples. These are all directly from the course and exam description. So just to list off a few, in the Southwest, or what is sometimes called Mesoamerica, or Mexico and America, right? We have settled cities like Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City. We also have the Pueblo communities up in like New Mexico and Arizona who have irrigation to grow crops like maize, corn. In their dry climate, they have sophisticated trade routes. They have connections with each other. In the Great Plains, in the middle of the country, we have tribes that have largely developed as nomadic, meaning they move around within their territory as a response to the scarce resources, right? So it's a good example of like an adaptation. One example of a Great Plains tribe is the Sioux. You spell that S-I-O-U-X, the Sioux. They're dominant in the northern part of the Great Plains for most of the time period that this class is concerned with. On the East Coast, which is very heavily forested, we have tribes like the Powhatan, the Haudenosaunee, which is the correct name for the Iroquois, the Cherokee. They're living in settled villages. They're living in log dwellings, so they've cut down forests, right? They're hunting and farming. Another thing that you need to know is not just how native societies adapted to their environments, but also how they in turn impacted the environment. So things that they did that like impacted or changed the environment. So some examples are things like terrace farming, which was common in Mesoamerica. They would cut steps into the side of mountain slopes to be able to grow crops. So that's like literally reshaping the land. It's a good example. Another example that is worth jotting down is called slash and burn agriculture. This was common on the Atlantic seaboard or the East Coast, where they would deliberately set fire to areas, kind of controlled burns to clear out like trees and undergrowth and clear the land so that they could farm it. So again, a great example of sort of like shaping the land itself. The next thing that you need to know about native societies, it has more to do with what happens when Europeans start to arrive. So we're sort of trending out of 1491 and into 1492. First, a very specific key term that you need to know is the Columbian exchange. This is a historian term for the unintentional exchange of like plants, animals, ideas, diseases, as people from North America encounter people from Europe and Africa for the first time, right across the Atlantic Ocean. Important things. This is not a formal trading or economic system. It's not like the transatlantic slave trade. It's not like encomienda. It's like accidental or incidental. It's not intended. It's not like, hello, here is a horse and I will trade you for potatoes, right? It's more just the kind of thing that happens when people encounter each other. You need to know a couple of examples of things that came from Europe or Africa to the Americas, and a couple of examples of things that came from the Americas to Europe. So here's you can see them on the slide, but here's a couple that I want to highlight. Coming from Europe, a few of the biggest things are horses and pigs, and then of course diseases. The more specific you can be, the better, and the specific disease that you probably want to remember is smallpox. This is a very commonly tested topic for historical period one. Disease devastates the native populations who had not developed immunity to these diseases coming from mostly from Europe. Going in the other direction, coming from the Americas, lots of like pretty easy to grow and nutritious foods, things like potatoes, tomatoes, squash. Tobacco is not a food, right, but it's also a significant plant exchange. These foods will have a very significant impact on the lives of Europeans, especially peasants. This exchange, and especially the discovery and claiming of vast new lands, really kickstart the end of feudalism and the rise of capitalism in Europe. So really like profound impacts on Europe from the Columbian exchange. Special note before we move off of this term, the Columbian exchange starts in 1492 with like Columbus's voyages, right? That's where it gets the name. It stretches for maybe like 100 years if you're talking again about incidental exchange that happens when people encounter each other for the first time. That only goes on for so long. So if you are looking at a question like an LEQ prompt or an SAQ, and it deals with the 1500s, like the year starts with a 15, then the Columbian exchange is like totally fair game. Go for it, talk about it. But if it's later than that, if it's a question about the 1600s or the 1700s, you should probably not be talking about the Columbian exchange, except maybe as contextualization. So it was definitely done by then, right? We done been encountered. People got potatoes. Horses are here, right? So just be careful about the timing on that. I see students make that error a lot. After the first encounters, of course, comes empire building and settlement. So before the British, which is where we're at in this historical period, you have New Spain, which was the first, organized in 1521 after Cortes conquered Tenochtitlan. Then New France, organized up along the inland waterways of modern Canada. You can see it right there on the slide in orange in the map. That was founded in the 1530s. And then you have the Dutch. They're a small commercial colony of New Netherlands, established kind of where modern-day New York City is and a little bit into upstate. That's in red on the map around 1614. Historical period 2 will have more about kind of comparing these empires at their height, so we're going to like come back and do that in a bit more depth next historical period. But for now, a little bit about the cultural adaptations that happened as European settlers in these empires live in close contact with Native Americans, Africans, right, over the colonial period. What do European settlers take from natives, and what happens in return? So first, what do European settlers take from indigenous people? A really big one is crop and farming techniques, especially the Three Sisters method of growing corn is a really good example of this. In New France, up along the inland waterways, fur traders called the coureurs de bois, it's like wayfarers of the woods, basically in French. They adopt obviously fur trading, but also native modes of transport that are good for traveling on inland waterways, like the birch bark canoe is a great specific example there. In addition, European colonists, especially later generations, will adopt more like native or indigenous fighting styles that work well in North American landscapes, guerrilla warfare style tactics in the French and Indian War, and even in the American Revolution are a good example of that. Going the other direction, examples of like responses or adoptions that native societies have from like European culture. A really big one is obviously horses, which are brand new to North America. The Spanish bring them. Lots of the horses escape and then make their way up to the Great Plains even before actual like Europeans get there, right? The horses get there. So they become very significant to the tribes of the Great Plains. They had previously chased buffalo on foot. They had used like sled dogs to migrate and carry them, themselves and their household goods. But now with these horses that are breeding on the plains, they're able to like tame them and become a really dominant warrior culture. Again, even before like European settlement actually arrives in the region. Other examples, things like firearms and gunpowder, which North American societies did not have. That obviously transforms native warfare, tribal relations. You get metal tools replacing traditional like stone or flint tools. European-made like clothing, textiles, frequently adopted, like replacing or supplementing traditional hide clothing. Of all of the non-British empires, the one that you need to know the most about is New Spain. Spain is the dominant colonizer in the Americas before the British show up. And the key concepts really reflect that. Like if you look at both historical period 1 and historical period 2, you're going to see Spain popping up in its own key concepts or its own like sometimes kind of like the sub-key concepts much more often than like New France, for example. So a few things that you need to know about New Spain. Number one, labor systems. So a labor system is any system that a society uses to get its like work, its tasks, its production completed. Examples of like later labor systems that we've talked about in this class would be like race-based chattel slavery, indentured servitude, wage labor once the Industrial Revolution starts, right? Those kinds of things. In colonial New Spain, their very first labor system is called encomienda. This is where the Spanish crown, like whoever the monarch is, gave Spanish colonists the labor of any Native American who lived on like their land grant in exchange for, at least in theory, the colonists Christianizing and protecting those natives. This native labor was mostly used for mining, especially silver, and also agricultural work. It's not like quite slavery because the colonists own the labor of the Native Americans. They don't actually own the Native Americans, but it's kind of hair splitting in practice. It's very highly exploitative. In fact, the system of encomienda leads to like such bad mistreatment of natives that we see debates springing back up in Europe. This is a key concept about debates over treatment of Native Americans. You can see down at the bottom of the slide, by far the most famous one, very common source of like stimulus that the College Board likes to use between two men, Juan de Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. Sepulveda supported encomienda, basically making the argument that natives are inferior, they're maybe not quite like real people, so immoral treatment of them is like basically not a problem. De las Casas, meanwhile, he was a Dominican friar, a Catholic priest, who had accompanied some of the early Spanish missions of conquest in the Americas, and he argued that mistreatment of natives was inhumane, it was not Christian. He encouraged like more peaceful conversion, and unfortunately, in some of his early arguments, encouraged the importation of enslaved Africans instead of like native labor, a system that's called asiento by the Spanish. Eventually, these debates did lead to the transition from encomienda to repartimiento in the late 1500s. This basically replaces like colonists owning native labor with the Spanish crown owning native labor. It's an improvement. Kind of. Other New Spain specific stuff that you need to know, again, we'll hit more New Spain stuff in historical period 2 as well. All of the major colonial empires have different ways of like organizing their society, interacting with the different races and ethnic groups within them. Usually that's European, African, and indigenous. In New Spain, especially as compared with the British colonies, there's really significant intermixing. That is, there's lots of like mixed race children being born between Europeans and indigenous people, and also Africans and indigenous people, a little bit less frequently Europeans and Africans. So the Spanish system famously develops a fairly rigid what's called like social caste system based on race mingling, with white Spanish people at the top, mixed race people in some kind of descending order, and natives and Africans at the bottom. There's some debate among historians about how like fixed or formalized this system actually was, but the key concepts do want you to understand that there was like a fairly rigid social hierarchy in New Spain, at least until the Pueblo Revolt. And this seems like contradictory, but it's true. There's also a lot of cultural mixing, or syncretism is the fancy word for cultural blending. You can see it most clearly in the Spanish colonies, where Spanish Catholicism mixes with African tribal traditions and sometimes indigenous traditions to create new religions, like Santeria in Cuba. Voodoo in Haiti is like French Catholicism plus African tribal traditions. Obe across the Caribbean and places like Jamaica has more like British influence. So these are good examples, again, of this like cultural mixing that we see happening. Another good term, anytime that there's a question about colonial era slavery, there's like a chance or an opportunity to talk about what are called maroon communities. This is a term for communities that form from runaway enslaved people who run away, not all the way back to Africa, of course, but into like inaccessible, usually mountain or swampy areas where it's hard for colonists to pursue them. These maroons tended to form communities that blended more deeply with the indigenous people of the area. This is an example of resistance to slavery, again, especially in the colonial era. That's a topic that the College Board frequently tests. It gets harder for these communities to like hide out the later you go in history, but they do play a big role, for example, in like the eventual Haitian Revolution, which is a term in historical period 3. The biggest point of change in colonial New Spain that the College Board will sometimes want you to know as a turning point comes in 1680 with the Pueblo Revolt. This is the only real successful colonial era like native rebellion. It's an uprising by the Pueblo. They lived in modern day New Mexico in the southwest against the Spanish colonizers. It's led by a man who's called Pope. There's a couple of different spellings of his name you can see in that first bullet point, but usually Pope with the accent. Led by Pope, the Pueblo killed over 400 Spaniards. All of the 2,000 settlers who were in the region are forced to flee. Keep in mind that New Mexico at the time was on the like very edge of what was New Spain. New Spain was centered in Mexico City, which is in kind of like central Mexico. So this was like the very sort of farmost outreaches of New Spain, which I think is part of the reason why the revolt is successful. This rebellion, like the intent is obviously to restore like indigenous land, indigenous culture, but it's especially about religion. It's an anti-colonial revolt, but I think it's important to understand that it's particularly against the like colonial Catholic Church and its attempts to suppress the Pueblo religion. The Spanish do return and reconquer the whole area by like 1700, so within 20 years. But after this revolt, they did adopt what the College Board refers to as more conciliatory policies towards natives, meaning that they tended to grant them like slightly greater autonomy. They tended to allow like a little bit more practice of like mixed or syncretic religious traditions, those kinds of things. Important to note the date on the Pueblo Revolt. This is 1680. That is not a historical period 1 date, but I'm talking about it here because it's really rare for you to get a question about New Spain where the dates wouldn't include the Pueblo Revolt, right? It's a really like central kind of term. So that brings us to the end of historical period 1. Again, if you look at all of the key concepts in the SED for historical period 1, you should be able to use all the terms that we just went over in this video to answer pretty much any writing questions that you might get asked that's about historical period 1 exclusively. Next time, more on the colonial empires and the British in historical period 2. Thanks, y'all.